taking off, you know, those vibrations that you hear are quite loud. They may be able to hear that. Then you have the mildly deaf or hard of hearing, who are the people who can hear a little bit of speech if you speak at a normal level. But how can I explain this? If you were to speak a little bit louder, so for example, now I am speaking a little bit louder, mais si par exemple je commence à parler en français, je ne pense pas que qui que ce soit comprendrait ce que je dis. What I just said is that even though I'm speaking louder, you do not understand what I'm saying because I started to speak French. So to them, they can hear that if I was to say, I'm talking to myself, I'm just whispering, so I know you're not talking to me. But if I'm looking at you and I say, you're like, oh, are they talking to me? If I speak louder, then you can hear a sound, but it's not clear. You can hear that the person is talking and not burping or singing, but you don't know exactly what they're saying. And that's the sort of hearing they have, if that makes any sense at all. And then you have the moderately deaf people, who are usually the older people when you just lose your hearing. After the age of 30, your hearing decreases, and that's a natural process. You know, when they say that you sort of like go backwards when you get older. And so they don't hear the soft sounds, but they will hear the usual background noises that we hear. It's just that it's slightly quieter for them. So what I am going to focus, the group of people I'm going to focus on is the profoundly deaf people, because I'm going to explain why, but not that the other categories are not important, but it's simply that sometimes they lose their hearing because of medical conditions. They lose their hearing later on in life, and they do not identify as deaf. They will say, oh, I lost my hearing, but I'm still hearing. And notice that I haven't said hearing loss. I haven't mentioned hearing loss, and I'm particular about that word simply because a lot of deaf people were born deaf. So they haven't lost their hearing. They never had it. And even though they did, they sometimes lose it at a very early age. And again, they have no recollection of what hearing is like. Therefore, they do not say they lost their hearing. They'll say, I was born profoundly deaf. As I said, you can lose your hearing because of accidents, illnesses, loud music, the pressure in planes, that happens quite a lot. But depending on your upbringing or your environment, or their environment rather, some deaf people will identify as deaf. So even though they are severely deaf, hard of hearing, moderately deaf, or profoundly deaf, they will identify as deaf. And the reason I say that is because, again, deafness for deaf people is not a disability at all. In fact, we're not going to say deafness anymore. We're going to talk about DEAFHOOD, because deafness is more of a medical term that has sort of like negative connotation. We say deafness, you're deaf, ooh, we need to fix you. What is DEAFHOOD? DEAFHOOD is a term coined by Dr. Paddy Ladd. He's deaf himself. In the deaf community, we call him Paddy Ladd. That means Jesus in British Sign Language, because he looks like the so-called Jesus, long hair, blue eyes, and a beard. And DEAFHOOD is, well, I'm going to read the definition, if I can find it. Yes. So DEAFHOOD is defined as a process by which deaf individuals come to actualize their deaf identity, positing that these individuals construct that identity to their heightened forms by various factors such as nation, era, and classes. So what does that mean? It's simply the fact that a deaf person is no longer the deaf person, you deaf, oh, I'm so sorry. Or they wouldn't say, oh, sorry, I'm deaf, I can't hear, can you do this and that? No, they fully embrace their culture, their identity as a deaf person. I am deaf and I am proud, and there is nothing wrong with me. The only wrong thing is that you cannot communicate with me, but I can surely communicate with you. And I'm going to show you a little comic strip that is called That Deaf Guy by two Americans, Matt and Kay Daigle. That Deaf Guy is a comic strip that is simply the irony of being deaf and being hearing. So that deaf man with the brown hair is actually married to a hearing woman, and they have a hearing son. and they have loads of different adventures. But those little comic strip, I think, illustrate what I said quite well. So that deaf man with the brown hair is speaking to his colleague. His colleague is hearing, and he used the written form of communication. And he asks him, do you miss, being able to hear? And the guy say, do you miss being able, do you miss being deaf? And the guy's like, I've never been deaf. It's like, well, there you go. You've never been deaf, so you don't miss being deaf. I've never been hearing, so I don't miss being hearing. I don't know what I missed, so I haven't missed anything. I'm good. The problem is in your eyes, not mine. I thought it was quite funny. Okay. Now it's telling me I cannot change. Yeah. Okay. Now on to a bit of history. So this history is specific to British history. And as I said, again, I do apologize if I go off the point at times. I'm going to try and be very concise. I'm going to give you a few key dates. A lot of people ask me, where does sign language come from? And it's so silly that we don't have one international sign language. I usually tend to answer them, it's really silly that we don't have one international language. Not everybody speaks English, not everybody speaks French, Swedish, so on and so forth. And it's exactly the same for deaf people. Different cultures, different ways of responding, different ways of doing facial expression. Therefore, we have different sign languages. Here in the UK, between the 673 and 735, not that is really important, but it's the first recollection of defined use of fingers for the alphabet. That's the first time they talked about sign language. In fact, the monks at the time, the church altogether had a duty of care towards the deaf people. And what they were saying is that those guys, they will go to hell. They're deaf and dumb. That's what they used to say. Dumb because they could not answer questions or repeat back information, therefore had no intelligence to be able to talk. And so they were dumb. But also they could not say the Lord's Prayer, which meant that they were going to hell, as it was believed. When the monks were doing the vow of silence, they still had to communicate with their fellow monk friend. I was going to say monkey, sorry. That's not. Ooh, sorry. Their fellow friends. They still had, I'm so sorry. They still had to communicate. And how would they do that? I think it's simple human interaction. If you want to eat, but you're not allowed to talk, I would say, I think it's quite natural, right? You would just say, should we eat now? And go and eat. And so they decided that actually, if we create a system of communication where we can talk to one another, that would be so much easier. And we would still be able to say if something is wrong or if something is right or how you're feeling through sign language or gesture. And then they thought, if we can teach that to deaf people, they could surely say the Lord's Prayer, they will be saved. And because it was their duty of care to look after deaf people or any person in the community that was disabled, they started to develop sign language a little bit more. Now, fast forward in 1760, there was a brilliant man called Thomas Braidwood, and he is the one who opened the first school for the deaf here in the UK, in the south of England, the richer part of England, as the north was a little bit poorer. To go to a specialized school, you would have to pay. Nowadays, the council covers the cost, but before you had to pay. And what he would use was total communication. So gesture, pointing, some sign language, the alphabets of finger spelling, lip reading, all sorts. And somehow his methods were recognized as really good methods, because students would come out of the school literate. They were able to read, to count, to write, and even one of them became a member of the parliament. And the American heard of that, because don't forget that it's not just a British problem, it's a worldwide problem. The American heard of that and they thought, this guy, he built a school, and also people are just, no, okay, let's pack our stuff. They took their little boat, went over to England 10 days later. My goodness, dedication. Went to England and they said, right, Thomas, tell us, how did you do this? How do you teach the kids? Let us know. We need to learn because we need to teach our kids in America. And Thomas was like, I'm not going to tell you guys. Are you serious? You, the Americans, you coming here to steal my methods of communication. No, thank you. I'm not telling you. What? But we speak the same language. We have the same. Are you really? No, I'm not teaching you. I'm not telling you. He refused to share his methods. So what the Americans did, they went over to France and they went to see a man called Abbé de l'Épée, which means abbey, an abbey of the sword. That's what it means in French. He's also known as the father of the deaf. This guy was so dedicated. He was one of the best advocates up to today, hearing advocate for the deaf, defending them and really wanting to give them a voice and trying to make hearing people understand that you don't speak their language. You don't speak Spanish either. You don't see them as less because they don't speak French. So deaf people are exactly the same. Teach them a language and you'll be able to understand them. They have a soul. They have a voice. It's just a different one than yours. And he was really fighting for it. He was one of the, well, he's the first person to also open a school in Paris for the deaf people. And happily, he shared his methods. He went over to Holland, to, I think, Norway. I should have researched that. Belgium as well. And he taught people the alphabet and then said, listen, you have the alphabet, that's your base, okay? But then if you want to talk about a table, how are your tables in your country? They're round, okay, so here, a table. This is a table, that's one sign. Next, what do you see? Be visual. And he was giving like a lot of tips as for how to create and build sign language in different countries. And when the American heard of that, after being rejected here in England, they went over to France and they say, yeah, don't you worry, go back to America, we'll come and we'll help you. And that's why sign language in French, in Dutch, and in Belgium is so common, because we had the same French person teaching other people. Now, some people say that if the British were not so snobbish, maybe we would have had the same sign language. But even in Anglo-Saxon countries, we have different sign languages. So New Zealand, Australia, America, Canada, and England. Okay, fast forward now, in 1880, there was the Milan Congress. The Milan Congress was the second international congress they had for education for deaf people. And they decided on that day that sign language was inferior to oralism. Oralism is a method of teaching. So you are deaf, you cannot hear any sound, but I'm going to force you to say a word. So I'm going to put my fingers in your mouth so you can say A, B, C, or whatever. I'd say A like it's in French. A, sorry, not A. And they would also like touch their throat and put their fingers in their ears. And really, as you can probably see actually in that little picture with that little boy who touches his jaw to match the sound of the teacher. If I touch your face, if I put my fingers in your mouth, maybe I can say amen, A, B, C, D, or something like that. And that's how they would teach them. The methods were so rough. Sometimes they would put like vinegar in their mouth so they could just be like, exactly, that's a P. Oh, exactly, that's a B. And that's how they would teach kids. Now, they took a couple of kids that were probably moderately deaf or mildly deaf, and they said, okay, say your name. Can you say your name? Yes, my name is George Hamilton. Oh, glory, a deaf person can speak. You see, you should not teach them to sign, because that's for the monkeys. Move that. Teach them to speak, and they will learn. And this is how sign language was banned from education. And really, nobody was signing, full stop, because at the time they thought that it was inferior, that it was more an animalistic way of communicating, and they banned that. A lot of schools were closed. A lot of people, deaf people and hearing people, lost their job, unfortunately. And without going into further details, fast forward, a lot of deaf and hearing people came together and really fought to reinstall that method of communication, which is sign language, because it's so natural for deaf people. If you go to a country and you're looking for something, you want to go to the toilet, you wouldn't be like, if you say, for example, I don't know, in Russian, apologies if anybody speaks Russian, but if you say blah, 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 to say toilet, and you don't know how to say toilet because you can say blah, 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 what would you do? You wouldn't say, let me try and speak or try to pronounce. You can't. You really want to pee. You need to go. So you would naturally just like, would be like, where? That's something that's quite natural. So they fought really hard to reinstall sign language, which was successful. And then sign language methods or methods of teaching were reinstalled in school, little by little. There were a lot of how do you call that, associations that were helping the deaf people, and so on and so forth. And that didn't happen only here in Britain, but that happened worldwide. Even in America, they had a gentleman called Gallaudet, and Gallaudet opened the first university for the deaf. Because again, a lot of people think, oh, but you're deaf. You can't go to school. Oh, you're deaf. You can't drive. Oh, you're deaf. You can't do this. You can't do that. And like, no, they definitely can. They speak a different language. And yes, they cannot hear. But don't fix your mind on what they cannot do, but rather what they can do. Why now we're saying that deaf people are from a different culture? Not only because they cannot hear, but it's just the way they do things. It's very different from how we do life. Before technology, you can just imagine how things were difficult for the deaf people, especially for communicating. Now, not all deaf people were living in the same place, right? So if I wanted to meet up with Natalie, who lives in the north of England, I wanted to send her a snail mail, a letter. She'll respond back and tell me, oh, sorry, I can't do in 3 weeks because I've got an appointment. Can we do in 4 weeks? I have to send her a letter back, tell her that I can't do 4 weeks because I've got this. Can you do in 6 weeks? And so on and so forth. And finally, when you would agree to a time and a place to meet, you would pray. You would pray really hard that there would be no train delays, there will be no problems, because a deaf person will wait. If you tell me, let's meet at 3 o'clock, I will wait. Here, I'll be there at 2:30, and then I will wait until 7 o'clock when I need to go back home, because you told me that's where we're meeting. And then you would hope that maybe a couple of days or a week later, you will get a letter saying, sorry, I couldn't meet up because I didn't have enough money to buy my train ticket. I've got a few deaf friends who actually told me that's what happened. And one said to his now wife to meet up at 7 o'clock at that pub. She thought it was another pub. She went to a different pub. They both waited at 2 different pubs, and they both went their ways. And she sent him a letter that was so sad, according to him, because she was like, how dare you making me wait all day long for you? You never came. I thought you loved me. And it was a miscommunication problem, because one was called Stag and Hounds and the other one was called Stag Do or something like that. I can't remember the exact example, but he thought that it was this one. She thought it was that one. Miscommunication. But 47 years later, they're happily married with 2 children. So it works. It's just really long way if we think about it. I know it's really difficult to think about communicating through letters because it's not something we do anymore. Well, some of us do. Wink, wink, Ida. But it's a really long way to communicate, just to arrange an appointment. So what will happen is that when finally me and Natalie can meet up after 3 months of back and forth letters, can I, when we meet up and we only have 3 hours. So Natalie lives in the north of England. Let's say I live at the very south, and we're going to try and meet in the middle. We meet in Wolverhampton, Midlands. Okay. When we meet up, we only have 3 or 4 hours, because then we need to go back on the train for our 6 hours journey. I don't have time to be cute and say, oh, how is your family and how is your husband and how is your new job? No, I'm going to ask you, so that new job, how is it? Is there a lot of deaf people? Can they sign a little bit? Do they treat you well? Oh, they don't treat you well. How is the pay? How much do you earn? You earn that much? Oh, that's good. Oh, I heard you married. How do you do sex? Nobody taught me how to do sex. How is it like? Oh, have you tried that new medicine they say for your ears? You put it in your ears? What happened to you? Oh, you spit. What color is your spit? Oh, it's purple. Ooh, that's disgusting. So if it's purple for me as well, then I should know. And that's exactly how deaf people would communicate. They need to have as much details as they can, because they only have a short time. Nobody else is going to give them that information, because they can't speak their language. And to be honest, hearing people don't bother. They'll be like, nah, don't worry about it. That's something they do a lot. Everybody will be laughing, ha, 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 and be like, oh, what did they say? Nah, don't worry about it. Or something will be very terrible. Oh my God. Oh, we're like, what happened? Don't worry about it. That's all they get. So when they meet a person who is deaf like them and understands their struggle and all the rest, they give information. Now, not much has changed today. When you ask a deaf person, how are you? Be ready for an answer, because they will tell you how they are. They will give you details about their mental health, about their physical health. If things come out of their body, they will tell you exactly what it looks like, what it smells like, and what's the consistency. That is not because they're rude, blunt, or, oh my God, they have no manners. No, they tell you. They want to share with you what it's like. So if you come across the same experience as them, A, it normalizes the problem they have, if it's a normal problem. And B, they just want to inform you of what is happening. The deaf way, I want to say the right way. Deaf people have a collective approach. What they think is that I'm not alone. I'm not alone in my deafness. There are other people out there. So we need to stick together. They work as a unity. When they lose one of their people, I want to say, it's tragic. It's tragic because it's one less person, but let's stick together. They're very collective. They do things together. Now, as I said, I'm generalizing, and it's not the same for every single deaf person in every single country, but that's the majority of deaf people. Information sharing is extremely important to them. As I said, not a lot of hearing people will take the time to tell them X, Y, or Z. So if I know something, oh, what did you say? Oh, it's about that. Oh, I need to let you know. This is what happens. So if it happens to you, then you know who to contact. Okay, great. Let's move on. And they keep sharing information. They don't want to leave anybody out because they work as a collective. They are a unit. They work as a unity. We are in this together, and I'm going to let you know what you need to know. I'm going to let you know if you can claim that benefit if you don't have a job. I'm going to let you know where it is a good place to work because people are deaf friendly, and so on and so forth. They share information because it is important. How do we communicate with a deaf person when you do not know sign language? Well, the first thing I want to say is don't panic. Really don't panic. I know it's a natural instinct when a person say like, oh, when you say, oh, excuse me, can you move out the way, please? Rude, can you move out the way? And they turn around and say, oh, I'm deaf. And you go, oh, I'm so sorry. Don't apologize. They are more than okay to be deaf. They are deaf, and it's okay for a lot of deaf people to be deaf. I can assure you that. Try to communicate with them. If you can see that, for example, classic example actually, on a train platform, they're saying that the train to London has been cancelled, go to platform number 3. And there's that one person who has no earphones, no headphones, nothing, who's just there, just looking left and right, trying to look normal, like a hearing person, but everybody moves away, and there's that one person when everybody moves on the platform. If you think that it's worth letting them know that, you know, the train has changed platform, they want to go to London, feel free to approach them and try to speak to them and just tell them that train, the other platform, number 3 or number 2 or number 1 or whatever it is. Deaf people are extremely patient. They really are. It's not about your skills. It's not about how well you can sign or how well you can point or copy or mimic or whatever. They just really appreciate the fact that you're taking the time to communicate with them. And they will ask you to repeat again and again until they understand you. To us, hearing people is quite offensive. You say like, oh, sorry? No, we'll be like, oh, sure. Yes. You're like, I asked you for your date of birth. Oh, so sorry. That's so embarrassing. It happens quite a lot to us. But after the second time, when you haven't understood something, you tend to just feel silly or not want to bother and just, you know, step back and think like, nah, it's fine, let it go. Deaf people are not like that. They'll be more than happy to try to understand you and ask you to repeat again and again. So a few tips is to probably, when you speak, if there is a word that you have used that's quite, I want to call it a big word, then try to change the word for something that's a bit more simpler. Sometimes we use like everyday language, and we don't realize how much it can, or how people may not understand that particular word, but because we're so used to saying it, so we just say it, and then we're like, okay, say that word. Okay, I'm saying something silly, uneasy. It's like, uneasy? What's that? It's like uneasy. Uneasy. You don't understand uneasy because some letters are actually quiet. When I say uneasy, you don't really see my mouth moving that much. If I say metal, you can see I said M, metal. But if I say uneasy, My mouth doesn't move that much. So it may be a word that they don't hear. But if you say hard with a facial expression, hard, they'll be like, oh, something that's not easy. Oh, something hard. Okay, I get it. So try to change the word. There's a written method as well, as we saw in the little comic strip. Sometimes you would panic. You'd be like, no, I don't know. And so you want to pick a piece of paper and a pen, or just use your phone. Brilliant tool. You can just write something, type it, show them. Don't use full sentences and elaborate words just to say something like train, platform, change. That's it. Don't write, unfortunately, the train that you were meant to take, my dear, has now changed. It's useless words to them. They don't, British Sign Language is not structured the same way as English is. They don't have tenses like us, and pronouns and nouns and adverbs and all that kind of stuff is removed. They're visual. Their language is very, very visual. An example that I give all the time is that if I was, try to think for 5 seconds, be with me. If I was to say, George is playing guitar on a bridge. If you had to draw that, what would you draw first? George with a guitar, and then the bridge in the park. No, you wouldn't do that. You would think, okay, George plays the guitar on a bridge in a park. Okay, I've got to draw the park first, and then the bridge, and then I'll draw George playing a guitar, because that's how you would draw it. Sign language is constructed the exact same way. It's very visual. So before I said that there was George that was playing guitar in a park, I need to just understand the sentence first and then say it or give it in a visual way. Otherwise, what they see is George, a bridge, a park, a guitar. They don't put it together. That's how English is to them. So it's just a bunch of words put together, but it doesn't make sense. It's not cohesive. And then don't hesitate to use gesture. If you were saying like, oh, you need to run your train, run. Or to point. Pointing is not rude at all. Me, you, them is not rude at all. So you can point as much as you want. But do not exaggerate. Try to be as natural as possible. Use your facial expression, as I said. And the reason why I say not to exaggerate is because if you want to say, oh my God, you're deaf. Okay, I know, sign. Oh, it's quite offensive. They feel diminished and patronized. So it's something to try and avoid. Now, I know that obviously, if you meet a deaf person for the first time, your heart races a little bit and just like, oh, you're deaf. Okay, communication up. Funny enough, if I was to say that I'm from, I don't know, Sweden, and I don't speak English, you wouldn't be scared. I think it's quite the opposite. You would think, oh, that's so cool. You're from Sweden, you speak Swedish. But what I'm trying to say with those little tips is that by trying to communicate with a deaf person, do not assume that they are all the same. As I said, there's different range of deafness. There are some deaf people who do not use sign language at all. Old method, nope, you won't sign like a monkey. You're going to learn how to speak, and they can speak quite well, I want to say, but they do not sign. So if you try to sign to them or point, they'll be like, excuse me? Some people simply use what we call the lip reading method. So they can hear a bit of sound, and if they follow your lip pattern, they can sort of make sense of what you say. Unfortunately, the communication is not always accurate, and they will miss a lot of information. As I said earlier, when you say something like uneasy, your mouth doesn't move that much. So if you add a bit of facial expression, then, or use different words, then it helps. Others will use sign language, and if you cannot sign, they won't expect you to be signing. Oh yeah, look at the person, they sign. And other people, because they use sign language, writing is not really a thing for them. If you write, they'll be like, no, I don't get that. Try to sign to me. And when you make the effort to try and communicate with them in their language by simply asking them, how would you want to communicate? What they hear or see is that you're important to me. I want to know what you're saying. And I don't care if all you're trying to say is, girl, move out the way, I'm in a rush. You're taking time for me. I want to know what you're saying. So you matter, and that's what they hear, and that's why they appreciate it. Now, some things have changed over the years. Technology, as I said, is taking over, and people are now using their mobile phones more and more. We used to have letters. We used to write letters, and then we would meet up. That was the method of communication. Or later on, it became minicom. If you wanted to make an appointment, or if you wanted to speak to someone, you would use a minicom. Maybe I'm dating myself here and people don't know what a minicom is. Please tell me you know what a minicom is. Thumbs up. No. Oh, that's awkward. Okay, a minicom was a mini computer. You had a little keyboard and then a phone. And you had a sort of small screen. And you would be typing, you'd be dialing a number, and you would be typing what you need to say. So you would say, hello, need to book an appointment at a doctor's. And then they would see it and they'd be like, okay, what time would you like your appointment? And you would have your sort of conversation through a phone. And you used to make like a very horrible noise, like, and that's when you start typing. That used to be a method of communication. And minicom was, oh my goodness, revolutionary, because deaf people could be like, oh, so you're going to tell me that I can talk to somebody on the phone, like live? Oh, that's great. And then later on, we had smartphones. So people started to use video calls a bit more to be able to communicate. And that is great. But what about those who do not have access to technology? Then they are a bit isolated because nobody wants to take the time anymore to write letters and post it, and because it costs a lot of money and it takes such a long time. The older people who have always used the old method of communication, maybe the most modern equipment they have in their house is a fax. People do not use faxes anymore, so they have to really adapt, and that's a big culture shock for them. Hearing equipment. You probably have heard of hearing aids. You probably have seen it on people. It's something that rests on top of your ear. And what it does is like a mini speaker, basically. It just enhances the sound in your ear. Now, it doesn't make you hearing, but it just informs you that there is a louder sound. Unfortunately, I shouldn't say unfortunately, but those sounds, when they are picked up, they're just sounds. So at my workplace, there's 8 deaf people, and only 2 or 3 of them have hearing aids. And when there is a sound, because I'm really clumsy for those who know me, when I drop something, they're like, and I say, oh. But when they see my face, they don't know if I'm saying, oh, sorry, I made a noise, or oh, sorry, I farted. So they'll be like, did you just fart? And I'll be like, no, wait, no. It's like, I heard a noise. I was like, I just dropped my phone on the carpet, but all they hear is a noise. So they don't really know what's happening. And so a hearing aid will be mostly to indicate that there is something happening, and they may be aware of it with a delay, and they will look around. It doesn't make them hearing. Other equipments such as cochlear implant, which I told you is like basically here inside your ear, in the inner ear, is a sort of quite invasive, actually, surgery, because they cut your ear to put the implant here, and then they try to connect a sort of cable in the auditory nerve. I will go into more details if you want to know that, but try to connect an implant into the auditory nerve, which means that when the sound travels by waves and vibration, it gets in, and so you sort of recognize a sound. It doesn't mean that you will know exactly what sound it is, because you need a few months, if I may say years, of speech therapy to recognize some sounds. And most of the time it's quite scary for deaf people, because they hear nothing, and suddenly they can hear a bird tweeting or somebody typing. And it can be quite overwhelming for deaf people when they hear sounds for the first time, because there's so many to process. And because they do not know what is what, they would say random things like, oh, what was that? Is that your phone vibrating? Like, no, that's the fax machine. Oh, right, okay. And they hear, like, I don't know, the toilet flushing, like, oh, is that how a bird sounds? And it's like, no, that was the toilet. So it can be quite confusing, and a lot to learn from them. Some deaf people are very keen on having those equipments to be able to hear something, to be closer to the hearing community. I'm not, dismissing them, saying like, oh, you guys are silly. But I also think that it's a big influence on the hearing society to say, you're broken, let me fix you. Here is an equipment so you can actually hear a bit better. But that creates a divide in the deaf community, because people from the DEAFHOOD would tell you, be proud, man. You're deaf, and so what? Look at us. We're fine. We live. And others would say, we're fine, but we're missing information because they have a couple of toes in the hearing world and the rest of their body in the deaf world. And like, oh, but we're missing on that. And so it creates a lot of loneliness and isolation to them because they are not really accepted in the hearing world, and the deaf world sees them as a betrayers because they just want to be hearing and they want to know what's happening and their English level is good. And that naturally would lead to mental health issues. Schizophrenia, paranoia is a big one. A lot of deaf people are paranoid because if I was to suddenly you'll be like, who is she looking at? Who is she laughing at? Is she laughing at me? Is she looking at me? But you can hear me. I wasn't saying anything. I was just randomly pointing at. I'm not even looking at anyone because I'm looking at my camera. But a deaf person who cannot hear anything, there's so many things happening around them, and they see a person at a pub just sat there, just be like, to say, oh, good one, George. But they are sat sort of next to George. They will think, oh, they're laughing at me. They were looking at me. They were laughing at me. And that's how paranoia starts, because you're not aware, but you don't know what is happening really around you because you cannot hear the information. So you start thinking, they're talking about me. He's looking at me. They're thinking of me. And it's quite a common thing for deaf people, as well as depression, because even though they are a very strong and small community, as I said, they don't all live in the same place. Other people are with their hearing family and they say, oh, but you're going to have a good job. And they get a good job at Heathrow Airport. Oh my goodness, my child is deaf, but they work at the airport. How posh, how great. And so they think, well, that's what mom and dad said. So they stay working at Heathrow Airport. Nobody can communicate with them. They can see their friends every now and then, but it's not so great. And it leads to depression. If you remember, earlier I asked you if you'd rather be deaf or blind. The reason being, there are the top five reasons of committing suicide here in the UK are the following: depression, mental health issues, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, divorce, mental and physical abuse, and deafness. Deafness is part of the top 5 reasons why people would commit suicide. They're isolated, they lack information, so their mental health issue is a really big thing in the deaf community. Luckily, the reason why they manage to combat those mental health issues is because they communicate a lot. They have a sense of togetherness. They come together, they share information, and they don't get tired. They're patient. They will give you as much details as you need or as you want. They will listen. They will take the time for you. And if there's anything they can help you with, and I mean anything, they will. Funny enough, blindness does not come as close as deafness as a reason to commit suicide. In fact, I think it's something like 20 or between 17 and 20th reason why people commit suicide here in the UK. They still have access to information even though they cannot see it. They still know somebody's talking about them. If they say, oh, look at that person with that trousers or with that hair, they'll be like, well, that's me. I'm not silly. I can hear you. So blindness doesn't come in the top 5 reasons as for why people will commit suicide. So you would think that deaf people have it harder than blind people. And yes, as I said, I don't try to generalize. Some people have it harder than others. Some people suffer more than others. But what I'm trying to say here is that the deaf community looks so much like, I believe, what God intends us to be together, to fight the problems that we have in the community by having that sense of belonging, by sharing information, by coming together. That connection is what combats depression, mental health issues. If you're isolated, if you know nothing, that's when you become recluse, you become sad, depressed, and all the rest. But deaf people come together without a problem. In fact, even when they have an issue, if I have an issue with George, I would say, we have a problem, we have beef. So please, Natalie and Ida, can we come and have that discussion? And you would think, why are they coming? Because they need to reason us. They need to mediate. You know, if we have a problem, we'll talk about it, and they will be there to say, well, George said this, but you said that. And at the end of the conversation, we may or may not have resolved the conflict, but we will go for glass of water down the pub. We will still go out. We will still do things together. And then at the end of it, be like, oh, you know, you really made me angry, and I don't like when you think like this. It's like, oh, come on, but I said I was sorry. Yeah, you're sorry, but you still made me angry. Okay, next time I won't make you angry. Fine, done, sorted. Again, it's not always like that, but most of the time, and I have witnessed it, that's how they do. And I'm just so excited and honored when I asked God when I was 19, and he answered on the 25th of April 2009. And he told me, I would like you to be a sign language interpreter because I think you would be good at it. And I said, yes. I said, okay, if that's what you think I should be, then yes, why not? I had no idea what I was in for. I thought that I was the hearing person bringing something to the disabled. Little did I know that that story that I read, I was so excited about, that Ephatha wasn't for that blind man, that deaf man, but it was for me. It was for my mind to be open and to learn. And I, again, as I said earlier, I strongly believe that when Jesus said, be open-minded, open your heart to a different way of communicating, to a different way of doing life, which is so close to my heart, because as a believer, I should be wanting to share information as soon as there's something that I think will be valuable for people. Why should I be like, I'm not telling Ida how to make millions? That's my secret. I'm not telling her. I'm not teaching her my ways of cooking, healthy food. That's my secret. It stays in the family. No, I should want everybody's well-being, because at the end of the day, we're all in the same boat. And I'm truly happy and proud to be a very small, teeny tiny person starting to enter the deaf community, to learn from them. And I'm not saying that I will bring something to them. Definitely not. This is no longer my intention. We're talking 11 years after, I'm giving away my age, 11 years after. I have no intentions to bring something to the deaf community because they need the hero of that Vivi is as a hearing person. Not at all. I'm here to learn, and I'm learning so much with them. And it's just really and extremely exciting. I just want to thank you for your willingness to learn a little bit today and to hear what I have to say. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Yeah, science.